My son told me I wasn't good enough to walk him down the aisle. After 32 years of raising him, of being there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph, he said his stepfather would do it instead. The man who'd been in his life for barely 5 years suddenly deserved that honor more than me. I stood there in my kitchen, holding the phone, feeling like everything I'd ever been as a father had just been erased with 8 words. Dad, I think Richard should walk me down. But what happened at that wedding? What the groom himself did when he saw me standing alone in the back? That's a moment that changed everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I was making my morning coffee when my son called to tell me I wasn't good enough to walk him down the aisle. It was a Tuesday morning in March, nothing special about it. The kind of ordinary morning where you're thinking about mundane things, whether you need milk from the store, if it's going to rain later. I had just pressed the button on my coffee maker and was standing there in my kitchen watching the dark liquid drip into the pot when my phone rang. "Hey, Dad." Michael's voice sounded different, distant, like he was calling from somewhere much farther away than the 15 miles between his apartment and mine. "Michael, good morning. How are you doing?" There was a pause. Not the comfortable kind of pause we used to have, where silence felt natural between us. This was the kind of pause that makes your stomach tighten without knowing why. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something, about the wedding." I smiled, leaning against my kitchen counter. His wedding was 3 weeks away, and I'd been looking forward to it for months. Looking forward to walking my son down the aisle, to that moment every father dreams about. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "Well, Linda and Richard and I have been talking, and we think it would be better if Richard walked me down the aisle instead of you." The coffee maker finished brewing with a small beep, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. My hand gripped the phone tighter. "What?" "Richard's going to walk me down the aisle, Dad. We think it makes more sense." If you've ever felt like you've been replaced by someone who never earned what you built, if you've ever watched someone else take credit for your life's work, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The words hit me like a physical blow. Richard, his mother's husband of 5 years, a man who'd been in Michael's life for barely a fraction of the time I'd spent raising him, a man who'd never changed a single diaper, never stayed up through feverish nights, never taught him to ride a bike or throw a baseball or tie his shoes. "Michael, I don't understand. Why would Richard—" "Dad, it's just, he's been more involved lately. He's helping with the wedding costs, and he's family now, and it just makes sense." Family now. The words echoed in my head, as if 32 years of being his father somehow didn't qualify as family, as if the man who'd held him as a newborn, who'd walked the floors with him during colic, who'd cheered at every Little League game and school play, was somehow less family than a man who'd shown up when Michael was already 24 years old. My hands started shaking. I set the phone down on the counter and put it on speaker because I couldn't trust myself to keep holding it steady. "Michael, we've talked about this. I've been planning to walk you down the aisle since the day you were born. This is something I've dreamed about." "I know, Dad, but things change. Richard's really stepped up, and he's done so much for us, and—" His voice sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. These weren't Michael's words. These were phrases I'd heard before, coming out of Richard's mouth during awkward family gatherings. "Son, think about what you're saying. I raised you. I was there for everything. Your first steps, your first day of school, when you broke your arm falling off your bike. Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Make this harder, as if I was being unreasonable for expecting to walk my own son down the aisle, as if 32 years of fatherhood was something I needed to just get over." I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. I looked around my small kitchen, at the refrigerator covered with pictures of Michael and me from over the years, at the Father's Day cards he'd made as a child that I still had taped to the cabinet, at the coffee mug he'd given me for my 50th birthday that said, "World's Best Dad." "Michael, what about all the times we talked about your wedding? Remember when you were 12 and you said you wanted me to walk you down the aisle someday? You said it would be the most important moment we'd ever share." There was another pause, longer this time. "That was a long time ago, Dad." A long time ago, as if love had an expiration date, as if being someone's father was something you could age out of. "Richard's been really good to Mom, and he's been good to me, too. He's helping pay for the wedding. He found us the venue. He's been involved in all the planning." Because I wasn't asked to be involved. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Michael, you never asked me to help with any of that. You never told me about venue shopping or planning meetings. How was I supposed to be involved when no one told me there was anything to be involved in? Dad, you're getting upset. I was getting upset. 32 years of being pushed to the sidelines, and I was finally getting upset. But I tried to pull it back, tried to find the calm voice that used to work when he was younger. I'm not upset, son. I'm hurt. There's a difference. And I'm hurt because I love you, and I can't understand how a man who's known you for 5 years gets to take the place of your father at your wedding. He's not taking your place. You'll still be there. You'll still be my dad. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. We both knew that wasn't true. There are moments that define relationships, moments that say who matters and who doesn't. Walking your son down the aisle is one of those moments, and he was giving that moment to someone else. Michael, I need you to really think about this. Not about what Richard wants, or what your mother wants, but what you want. Do you really want Richard to walk you down the aisle, or is this something you're doing because you feel pressured? Nobody's pressuring me, Dad. This is my choice. My choice. The words felt like a knife, because I knew deep down that Michael believed he was making his own choice. He didn't realize how carefully he'd been maneuvered to this point, how every conversation over the past 5 years had been designed to make him see Richard as the more present, more successful, more worthy father figure. I thought about all the times Michael had canceled our weekend plans because Richard had planned something special, all the times he'd compared my modest apartment to Richard's big house, my 10-year-old truck to Richard's luxury cars, all the times he'd mentioned casually that Richard had taught him something I'd been trying to teach him for years. I'd been losing my son inch by inch, and I'd been too proud or too blind to see it happening. Son, I want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. But I need you to understand what this means. I need you to understand that you're not just choosing someone to walk you down an aisle, you're choosing who gets to be your father at the most important moment of your life. You're being dramatic, Dad. Dramatic. For wanting to fulfill the most basic expectation of fatherhood. For believing that raising a child for 32 years should count for something. Okay, I said finally. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. Okay, Michael. If that's what you want, then that's what we'll do. Really? You're okay with it? Was I okay with it? I felt like I was drowning. I felt like everything I'd ever been as a father had just been erased with 8 words. We think Richard should walk me down instead. But what choice did I have? I could fight it, make a scene, force Michael to choose between keeping me happy and keeping peace with his mother and stepfather. But I'd already lost that battle. If I pushed now, I risked losing him entirely. I want you to be happy, I said again. It was the only true thing I could manage. After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. The coffee had finished brewing, but I didn't pour any. I just stood there, looking at the phone in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being Michael's father and started being his biological dad. The difference is enormous, but it happens so gradually that you don't notice until it's too late. A father is someone who matters, someone whose opinion carries weight, someone who plays a central role in the big moments. A biological dad is someone who gets invited to events, but doesn't get to participate in them. Someone who gets tolerated rather than included. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Michael with his homework for 12 years, where we'd eaten countless breakfasts and dinners together, where he'd told me about his first girlfriend and his college acceptance letters and his job interviews. Now it felt like a monument to something that used to exist, but didn't anymore. The worst part wasn't even that Richard would walk him down the aisle. The worst part was how easily Michael had made the decision. There was no anguish in his voice, no recognition of what he was taking away from me. It was just a practical decision to him, like choosing between 2 caterers or 2 venues. That's when I realized how completely I'd been replaced, not just in the wedding, but in his heart. Richard wasn't taking my place. He'd already taken it, months or maybe years ago. The wedding walk was just the public announcement of something that had already happened in private. I thought about calling him back, about fighting harder for my place in his life. But I knew it wouldn't matter. You can't argue someone into loving you the way they used to. You can't convince someone to give you back a role they've already reassigned to someone else. I sat there until the coffee got cold, staring at my phone, understanding that I'd just lost my son to a man who never changed a diaper, never stayed up with him during fever nights, never taught him to ride a bike. Richard had won without even trying, simply by being newer, richer, and more present in Michael's daily life. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, filled with the ghosts of all the conversations Michael and I would never have, all the moments that would now belong to someone else. I'd spent 32 years building a relationship with my son, and in one 5-minute phone call, I'd learned it wasn't strong enough to survive someone else's money, influence, and strategic patience. I finally poured that cup of coffee, but my hands were still shaking, and I spilled it all over the counter. As I cleaned it up with paper towels, I couldn't help thinking that this was what my fatherhood had become. Just another mess to clean up quietly, alone in my kitchen, while the important moments of my son's life happened somewhere else, with someone else. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday in October, 8 years ago. I remember because Michael had a soccer game that Saturday, and Linda and I sat on opposite sides of the bleachers for the first time in his life. We told ourselves we were doing everything right. No lawyers screaming at each other, no fights over custody, no putting Michael in the middle of our problems. We were going to be the mature divorced couple who stayed friends for their child's sake. We were going to prove that two people could end their marriage without destroying their family. Looking back, I think our biggest mistake was believing that was possible. Linda and I had been growing apart for years before we finally admitted it. We weren't angry with each other, weren't bitter or cruel. We'd just become strangers living in the same house, going through the motions of being married without actually connecting anymore. The divorce felt like a relief more than a tragedy. We'd both been holding our breath for so long that signing those papers felt like we could finally exhale. Michael was 24 then, old enough that we didn't have to worry about custody arrangements or who he'd live with. He had his own apartment, his own job, his own life. We thought that made everything easier. We thought being adults meant he wouldn't be affected by our split the way younger children are. We were wrong about that too. The first few months after the divorce were actually pleasant. Linda moved into a smaller house across town, and I kept our old place until the market improved enough to sell it. Michael came over for dinner once a week, just like always. We texted regularly. He still called me when he needed advice or just wanted to talk. I thought we'd navigated the divorce without losing anything important. Then Richard appeared. Linda had met him at her new job. He was some kind of business consult. The type of man who wore expensive suits and drove cars that cost more than I made in a year. She mentioned him casually at first, the way you mention any new coworker. But I could hear something different in her voice when she said his name, something I hadn't heard in years. I wasn't jealous. That might sound strange, but I wasn't. Linda and I had been over long before we made it official. If she'd found someone who made her happy, I was genuinely glad for her. I even told Michael that when he asked how I felt about his mother dating someone new. As long as he treats her well, I said, I want her to be happy. I meant it at the time. I had no idea what I was signing up for. Richard seemed harmless enough when I first met him. Polite, well-dressed, the kind of man who shook your hand firmly and looked you in the eye when he talked to you. He was careful not to overstep boundaries, never tried to act like a parent to Michael, never made any moves that could be seen as threatening to my relationship with my son. But gradually, things started to change. It began with small things. Michael would mention going to dinner at Richard's country club, or how Richard had shown him how to play golf, or how Richard had given him advice about investing his money. Innocent stuff, really, the kind of things any successful man might share with his girlfriend's son. But then the comparisons started. Michael never made them directly, never said anything deliberately hurtful, but I'd hear it in the casual comments he'd make. How Richard's house had a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. How Richard had season tickets to the football team and took Michael to games in a luxury box. How Richard had connections at companies where Michael was applying for better jobs. I lived in a modest apartment by then, drove a truck that was older than I cared to admit, and worked the same middle Salmond management job I'd had for 15 years. Next to Richard's success, my life looked pretty ordinary. Next to Richard's generosity, my contributions looked pretty small. The first time Michael called me by my first name instead of Dad, I thought it was just a slip of the tongue. We were talking on the phone about his work, and he said something like, "Well, James, I think I'm going to take Richard's advice on this one. James, not Dad, just James, like I was any other acquaintance." I didn't say anything about it. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that he was just distracted or thinking about something else, but it stung more than I expected it to. When I mentioned it to Linda the next time we talked, she waved it off as no big deal. He's just adjusting to all the changes, she said. Richard's been really good for him, you know. Giving him guidance about career stuff, teaching him about financial planning. Things you and I never really knew much about. Things you and I never really knew much about. As if the 32 years I'd spent raising Michael, teaching him everything from how to tie his shoes to how to treat people with respect, was somehow less valuable than Richard's business advice. The family vacations were what really opened my eyes to what was happening. Michael started talking about trips he was taking with Linda and Richard. Weekend getaways to ski resorts, week-long cruises, flying to different cities for concerts or sporting events. He'd tell me about these trips afterward, showing me pictures on his phone, describing the fancy restaurants and luxury hotels. I was never invited. At first, I understood. Linda and Richard were building a new relationship, and it made sense that they'd want private time together, that including the ex-husband might make things awkward. But as the trips became more frequent and elaborate, as Michael became more excited about them, I started to realize what was really happening. Richard wasn't just dating Linda. He was systematically replacing me in Michael's life. It wasn't Molly's. Beaches exactly. Richard never said anything negative about me, never tried to turn Michael against me directly. Instead, he simply offered Michael a better version of everything I'd already given him. Where I had provided stability, Richard provided luxury. Where I had offered advice, Richard offered connections. Where I had given love, Richard gave opportunities. Michael started canceling our weekly dinners more often, always for good reasons. Richard had gotten tickets to something, or Linda was cooking a special meal, or they were leaving early for a weekend trip. Nothing I could argue with, nothing that made me look anything other than petty if I complained. The gifts got more expensive too. I'd give Michael a nice shirt for his birthday. Richard would give him a weekend in Las Vegas. I'd help him fix something in his apartment. Richard would pay to have it professionally repaired and upgraded. I was fighting a battle I didn't even know was happening, and I was losing it one small defeat at a time. The worst part was watching Michael change. Not dramatically, not in ways that would concern you if you didn't know him well, but I did know him well. I'd raised him. I could see him becoming someone different, someone who talked more about money and success and image, someone who measured relationships by what people could offer him rather than by love or history or loyalty. Richard never pushed him away from me directly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he just made his own presence so appealing, so beneficial, so necessary, that I started to fade into the background by comparison. Why call your dad for advice when Richard had better connections? Why spend time in my modest apartment when Richard's house was so much more comfortable? Why depend on my limited resources when Richard could provide so much more? I tried to compete for a while. I stretched my budget to buy better gifts, tried to plan more interesting activities, looked for ways to be more helpful in Michael's life, but I couldn't compete with Richard's money, and I couldn't match his influence, and eventually I stopped trying. That's when I realized I'd made a fundamental mistake. I'd thought love would be enough. I'd thought 32 years of history would count for something. I'd thought being someone's father was a permanent position, something that couldn't be taken away by someone with deeper pockets and better connections. But fatherhood, I learned, is more fragile than I'd imagined. It's not just about biology or history or even love. It's about relevance, about being the person someone turns to when they need something important. And Richard had systematically made himself more relevant in Michael's life than I was. The day I truly understood how far things had gone was about 6 months before the wedding. Michael was telling me about a promotion he'd gotten at work, and he was excited, talking fast the way he used to when he was a kid, and had good news to share. Richard introduced me to his friend who works there, he said. They'd been looking for someone with my background for months, but they weren't advertising the position. Richard made a call, got me an interview, and basically got me the job. He was so grateful to Richard, so impressed by his connections and influence, and I sat there listening, remembering all the times I'd helped Michael with his homework so he could get into college, all the times I'd driven him to interviews and waited in parking lots, all the support I'd given him over the years that had led to him being qualified for that job in the first place. But Richard got the credit because Richard made the call that mattered. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Finn. Ally understanding what had happened. I hadn't lost my son to Richard. I'd lost him to a version of success and security that I couldn't provide. Richard hadn't stolen Michael's love. He'd made himself indispensable in ways that made my love seem insufficient by comparison. Michael still cared about me, I knew that. But caring about someone and needing them are different things, and Richard had become the person Michael needed, while I'd become the person Michael remembered fondly, but didn't really require anymore. By the time Linda and Richard got married, a small ceremony I was invited to but felt out of place at, the transformation was complete. Michael had a new family now, one that could offer him things I never could. I was still his biological father, still welcome at family gatherings and birthday parties, still included in the peripheral moments of his life. But I was no longer central to his world. That position belonged to Richard now, and the most painful part was that Michael seemed happier for it. He had better job prospects, a more comfortable lifestyle, access to experiences and opportunities he'd never had before. In every practical way, Richard's presence in his life had been an improvement. I couldn't even be angry about it, not really. What kind of father wishes his son had fewer opportunities, less support, a smaller network of people who cared about him? What kind of man resents someone for giving his child advantages he couldn't provide himself? But understanding why something happens doesn't make it hurt less. Knowing that Michael was better off didn't make me feel less replaced. Being rational about Richard's positive influence didn't ease the sting of watching someone else become the father I'd always tried to be. The phone call about the wedding was just the final confirmation of something I'd already lost. By the time Michael called to tell me, Richard would walk him down the aisle. I'd already been demoted from father to biological dad, from essential to optional, from central to peripheral. I just hadn't wanted to admit it to myself until that Tuesday morning in March, standing in my kitchen, listening to my son explain why someone else deserved the honor I'd been dreaming about since the day he was born. 3 weeks. That's how long I had to watch my son's wedding happen without me. After that phone call, everything changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that other people would notice, but I felt the shift immediately, like stepping from solid ground onto something unsteady. Michael's calls became less frequent. When he did call, our conversations felt different, shorter, more careful, like he was checking items off a list rather than actually wanting to talk to me. There was a new formality to his voice, as if he'd already started practicing how to treat me like a guest at his own wedding instead of his father. "Hey, Dad, just wanted to let you know we finalized the menu for the reception." "That's great, son. What did you decide on?" Richard found this amazing caterer through one of his business contacts. They're doing a 5-course dinner with wine pairings. Richard found Richard's contacts. I wasn't even sure why Michael was telling me about it since I clearly hadn't been part of the decision-making process. But I listened anyway, trying to sound interested and supportive while feeling like I was hearing about someone else's family event. "Sounds wonderful. I'm sure it'll be perfect." "Yeah, Linda's really excited. She and Richard have been working with the wedding planner for months to get everything just right." Months. They'd been planning this for months, and I was just now hearing about the caterer. I wondered what other decisions had been made without my knowledge, what other aspects of my son's wedding I'd learn about secondhand. The guest list was another painful discovery. Michael mentioned it casually during one of our brief phone conversations, talking about how they'd had to cut some people because the venue had capacity limits. "We wanted to invite everyone, but we can only have 200 people, so we had to make some hard choices." 200 people. I started doing the math in my head, thinking about extended family members, family friends, people from Michael's work, Linda's side of the family, Richard's side. And I realized I probably knew less than 20 people on that list. At my own son's wedding, I'd be surrounded by strangers. "Will Aunt Sarah be there?" I asked. Sarah was my sister, the only family member I was really close to anymore. "Oh yeah, of course. She's family." Family. The word felt strange coming from him now, given that he'd essentially removed me from the family role in his wedding, but I didn't say anything. I'd learned not to challenge these things directly, because it only made Michael defensive and made me sound bitter. The bachelor party was announced on social media before Michael mentioned it to me. I saw the photos on Facebook. Michael and 8 other men at some upscale restaurant, all wearing matching shirts that said Michael's Last Stand. Richard was right there in the middle of them, arm around Michael's shoulder, both of them laughing at something. I stared at those photos for a long time, trying to identify the other men. A couple of Michael's college friends, some guys from his work, what looked like some of Richard's family members or friends. The kind of bachelor party I'd always imagined I'd help organize someday, the kind of celebration fathers and sons planned together. When Michael called me the next day, he mentioned the party like it was an afterthought. "Oh, by the way, we had the bachelor party last night. It was really fun. I saw the pictures on Facebook. Looked like a great time." "Yeah, Richard set the whole thing up. He knows the owner of this restaurant downtown, so we got a private room and everything, really classy." Richard set the whole thing up. Of course he did. I waited for Michael to say something else, maybe to apologize for not inviting me, or at least acknowledge that bachelor parties usually include the groom's father. But he just moved on to talking about something else, as if excluding me from his bachelor party was so natural it didn't even warrant explanation. That night, I called my sister Sarah. She was the only person I could talk to about any of this, the only one who understood how much I was hurting without making me feel like I was being unreasonable. "Sarah, I think I'm losing my mind." "What happened now?" I told her about the bachelor party, about being excluded from all the wedding planning, about feeling like a stranger in my own son's life. By the time I finished, I was crying. Actually crying, which I hadn't done in years. "James, I'm so sorry. This is just wrong." "But is it? Maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe this is just how things work now. Maybe I need to accept that Richard is more important to Michael than I am." "Stop that. You raised that boy for 32 years. You were there for everything that mattered. You don't become less important just because someone with more money shows up." But even as Sarah said it, we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Importance isn't just about history or love. It's about present relevance, about who people turn to when they need something, and increasingly, Michael was turning to Richard. The suit shopping happened without me, too. I only found out about it when Michael mentioned casually that they'd found the perfect tux. Richard took me to this place downtown where he gets his suits made. The guy there set me up with everything. Tux, shirt, tie, shoes, the whole thing. Really high-end stuff. "That's great," I said, though my throat felt tight. "I'm glad you found something you like." I'd been looking forward to going tux shopping with Michael since he'd gotten engaged. It seemed like one of those father-son traditions, one of the few wedding-related activities that would definitely include me. I'd even researched places in town, made a mental list of shops we could visit together. But Richard had taken care of it. Richard, with his connections and his expensive taste, and his ability to provide things I couldn't afford. Of course, Michael would want to go shopping with Richard rather than with me. Richard could get him a better tux from a better store, probably at a better price because of his business relationships. The cake tasting was another event I learned about after the fact. Michael posted a picture on Instagram of him and Linda and Richard sitting at a bakery table covered with different cake samples, all of them smiling and pointing at various slices. "Finally picked our wedding cake," the caption read. "Thanks to Richard for finding the most amazing bakery." I sat in my apartment looking at that photo, trying to remember if anyone had ever mentioned cake tasting to me. I didn't think they had. It was just another decision that got made without me, another wedding tradition that happened while I was somewhere else, uninformed and uninvited. When I offered to help with the costs, Michael's response was awkward and uncomfortable. "Thanks, Dad, but Richard's pretty much taking care of everything. He wanted to do this for us." "I'd still like to contribute something. This is my son's wedding." "I know, and I appreciate it, but honestly, everything's already handled. Richard's been really generous, and we don't want to make things complicated by having multiple people paying for different things." Multiple people. As if me wanting to contribute to my own son's wedding was some kind of administrative burden that would just complicate Richard's efficient management of the event. Maybe I could pay for the flowers, or the photographer, or... "Dad, really, it's fine. Richard's got it covered." Richard's got it covered. The phrase that summed up my entire relationship with Michael now. Whatever the situation, whatever the need, Richard had it covered. Richard could provide better solutions, better connections, better resources than I could. My offerings were unnecessary complications in a system that worked perfectly well without me. I started driving past the wedding venue sometimes. Not stalking, not doing anything weird. Just driving past on my way home from work, slowing down a little to look at the place where my son would get married. It was beautiful, a historic mansion with perfectly manicured grounds and a view of the lake, the kind of place I could never have afforded to rent, the kind of venue that required connections and advance booking and the sort of budget Richard could provide. I'd sit in my truck in the parking lot sometimes, trying to imagine where I'd fit in on the day of the wedding, trying to picture myself among Richard's friends and family, among the successful business people and well-dressed guests who would fill that beautiful space, trying to figure out where the groom's biological father sits when someone else is performing all the traditional father duties. The loneliness was different from anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't the loneliness of being alone. I'd been alone since the divorce, and I'd gotten used to that. This was the loneliness of being irrelevant, of being alive but already mourned, of losing your role while still being expected to show up and smile about it. Sarah invited me to dinner one night, about 2 weeks before the wedding, and I could tell she was worried about me. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "James, you're not fine. You look terrible. When's the last time you slept through the night?" I couldn't remember. I'd been lying awake most nights, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways I could have done things differently. All the ways I could have been a better father, a more successful man, someone who couldn't be so easily replaced. "I keep thinking about when Michael was little," I told her. "How he used to talk about his wedding someday. How he said he wanted me to walk him down the aisle. He was so sure about it, so excited about the idea of us sharing that moment. He was a child then. He didn't know about divorce and step-parents and all the complications that come with adult life." "But that's just it, Sarah. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's only complicated because Richard made it complicated, or maybe because I wasn't strong enough to fight it. You couldn't have fought this, James. You couldn't compete with someone who has that kind of money and influence. That doesn't make you a failure as a father." But it felt like failure. It felt like 32 years of love and sacrifice and daily presence hadn't been enough to secure my place in my son's life. It felt like I'd built something I thought was permanent, only to discover it could be dismantled by someone with better resources and more strategic thinking. The final blow came 5 days before the wedding, when Michael called to give me the schedule for the day. "The ceremony starts at 4, but you should probably get there around 3:30 to find a good seat." Find a good seat. As if I was just another guest, as if my relationship to the groom was no different from a college friend or a coworker. "Where should I sit?" I asked. There was a pause. Probably just wherever you're comfortable. I mean, the front rows are reserved for immediate family, but anywhere behind that should be fine." Immediate family. I wasn't immediate family anymore. Richard was immediate family. Richard would sit in the front row, would stand at the altar, would be part of the official wedding party. I would sit somewhere in the back, behind the immediate family, like any other invited guest. "Okay," I said, because what else could I say? "And then afterward, there's a cocktail hour and dinner. You're at table 12, I think. Sarah's at that table too, so you'll know someone." Table 12. Not the family table, not anywhere close to the wedding party. Table 12 with my sister and whoever else they needed to fill the remaining seats. After Michael hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the wedding invitation that was still stuck to my refrigerator with a magnet. "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Thompson request the honor of your presence at the marriage of Michael James Peterson." Even the invitation told the story. Richard's name was on it as the host, as the person welcoming guests to his event. My name appeared nowhere, despite the fact that the groom carried my last name, despite the fact that I'd been the one constant presence in his life for over 3 decades. I was invited to my own son's wedding the same way you'd invite a neighbor or an old family friend, politely, appropriately, but without any real expectation that my presence would matter to anyone. That night, I almost decided not to go. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, composing and deleting text messages to Michael telling him I wouldn't be able to make it after all. Some kind of emergency, some kind of last-minute conflict. It would be easier for everyone, I thought. Michael could have his perfect wedding with Richard playing the father role, and I could avoid the humiliation of watching it happen. But I couldn't do it. However much it hurt, however irrelevant I'd become, Michael was still my son. I'd been there for every important moment of his life, and I wasn't going to miss this one, even if I was only there as an observer. I hung my suit in the closet and tried to prepare myself for the hardest day of my life. The day I'd watch someone else live the moment I'd dreamed about since Michael was born. The day I'd sit in the back of a church and watch my son choose someone else to be his father when it mattered most. 3 weeks had never felt so long or so short. Long because every day was filled with the dread of what was coming. Short because I knew that once it was over, once Richard walked Michael down that aisle, something would be finished forever. The last pretense that I was still Michael's father in any meaningful way would be gone, and there would be no going back from that. I woke up at 5 in the morning on my son's wedding day, staring at the ceiling in my empty apartment, knowing this should have been the most important morning of my life as a father. Instead, it felt like a funeral. The sunlight was just starting to filter through my bedroom curtains, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself imagine how this morning was supposed to go. I should have been getting ready to pick up Michael, maybe sharing breakfast with him, helping him with his tie, giving him some last-minute fatherly advice. We should have been nervous together, excited together, preparing for the moment when I'd walk him down the aisle and officially hand him over to his new life. But Michael was across town getting ready with Richard. Richard was the one sharing breakfast with my son, helping him with his tie, giving him advice. Richard was the one experiencing the pride and nervousness and joy that should have been mine. I lay there for another hour, not wanting to get up, not wanting to start the day that would make my replacement official, but eventually I forced myself out of bed and into the shower, trying to wash away the dread that had been building in my chest for 3 weeks. I'd bought a new suit for the occasion, nothing fancy. I couldn't afford the kind of expensive clothes that Richard and his circle wore, but something respectable, navy blue, well-fitting, the kind of suit that would help me blend in among the wedding guests without drawing attention to myself. I wanted to look like I belonged there, even though we all knew I didn't. As I got dressed, I kept checking my phone, part of me hoping Michael might call. Maybe he'd realize at the last minute that he wanted his real father there while he got ready. Maybe he'd remember all the times I'd helped him prepare for important events throughout his life. Maybe he'd want to share this morning with me after all. But my phone stayed silent. By 10 o'clock, I was dressed and ready, with 6 hours to kill before the ceremony. I tried watching television, tried reading, tried doing anything to occupy my mind, but I couldn't focus on anything except what was happening across town. I kept picturing Michael getting ready, Richard being there for all the moments I should have been part of. Finally, I couldn't stand being in my apartment anymore. I got in my truck and started driving, with no real destination in mind. I just needed to move, to do something other than sit alone with my thoughts. I found myself driving past places that held memories of Michael and me. The park where I'd taught him to ride a bike, where I'd pushed him on swings when he was little. The baseball field where he'd played Little League, where I'd coached his team for 3 seasons. The high school where I'd watched him graduate, where I'd been so proud of the young man he'd become. All these places where I'd been Michael's dad, where my role in his life had been clear and central and unquestioned. Before Richard, before the gradual erosion of my importance, before I'd been relegated to the sidelines of my own son's life. I drove past the church where the wedding would be held. There were already people there, caterers setting up, florists arranging decorations, someone directing a small army of workers who were transforming the space into something beautiful and perfect. Richard's vision, Richard's resources, Richard's connections, making it all happen. I parked across the street and watched for a while, trying to spot Michael or Richard or Linda among the activity. But they weren't there yet. They were probably at Richard's house, having lunch, getting ready together like a family that didn't include me. Around 2 o'clock, I drove home and tried to eat something, but my stomach was too twisted with anxiety and grief to handle food. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd gotten that devastating phone call 3 weeks ago, and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I kept thinking about other fathers I knew, fathers who'd walked their sons down the aisle, who'd given speeches at wedding receptions, who'd been central figures in their children's most important moments. I thought about my own father, who'd been so proud when I got married, who'd insisted on paying for the rehearsal dinner even though money was tight, who'd cried during my wedding ceremony because he was so happy for me. My father had died 5 years ago, but if he were still alive, he'd be devastated by what was happening today. He'd raised me to believe that being a father was the most important job a man could have, that your children were your legacy, that the bond between father and child was sacred and unbreakable. But bonds can be broken, I'd learned. They can be eroded so gradually that you don't realize what's happening until it's too late. They can be replaced by newer, shinier relationships that offer more practical benefits than love and history ever could. At 3 o'clock, I got a seat in my truck and drove to the church. I was early. Michael had told me to arrive at 3:30, but I needed to be there, to claim whatever small space I could in this event that should have been partly mine. The church parking lot was filling up with expensive cars, Mercedes, BMWs, Audis, the kind of vehicles that Richard's friends and family would drive. My 10-year-old truck looked shabby among them, but I parked it anyway and walked toward the church entrance. Inside, the sanctuary had been transformed into something magnificent. White flowers everywhere, candles creating a warm glow, ribbons and decorations that probably cost more than I made in a month. It was beautiful, the kind of wedding that any father would be proud to give his son, except I wasn't giving it to him. Richard was. I found a seat in one of the back pews, just as Michael had suggested. Around me, other guests were arriving, well-dressed people who moved with the confidence that comes from success and social position. They greeted each other warmly, clearly part of an established social circle that I would never belong to. A few people glanced at me with mild curiosity, probably wondering who I was. I thought about introducing myself as the groom's father, but what would be the point? That title didn't mean anything anymore. Today, Richard was the groom's father in every way that mattered. Sarah arrived about 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She found me in my back row seat and slid in beside me, giving me a hug that I needed more than I could express. "How are you holding up?" she whispered. "I'm here," I said, which was about all I could manage. She squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you for coming. I know this can't be easy." Easy. Nothing about this was easy. Sitting in the back of the church like a stranger, watching other people take their places in the front rows, waiting to see my son get married without me playing any meaningful role in the ceremony. None of it was easy. At 10 minutes to 4, I saw Richard's family begin to take their seats in the front rows. Distinguished-looking people, the kind who belonged at country clubs and charity galas. Richard's parents, his siblings, their children, all of them settling into the places of honor, the places reserved for immediate family. Then I saw Linda arrive, looking beautiful in a mother-of-the-groom dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was escorted to the front row by one of Richard's relatives, smiling and gracious, clearly comfortable in her role as mother of the groom. She belonged here in a way I never could. And then, at 5 minutes to 4, I saw Michael. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, confident and happy, surrounded by his groomsmen as they took their positions at the front of the church. For a moment my heart swelled with pride. This was my son, the baby I'd held in the delivery room, the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been so proud of for 32 years. But then I saw Richard step up beside him, straightening Michael's tie, saying something that made Michael laugh. Richard was dressed in a tuxedo that matched Michael's, clearly designated as the father figure in this ceremony. He looked natural in the role, comfortable with the responsibility, proud to be standing there. I watched Michael's face as Richard spoke to him, and what I saw there broke my heart. Michael looked at Richard with respect, with gratitude, with something that looked very much like love, the kind of look a son gives his father before his wedding ceremony begins. The music started, and the processional began. The bride's attendants walked down the aisle, followed by the bridesmaids, each step bringing us closer to the moment I'd been dreading for 3 weeks. Then the bride appeared at the back of the church, radiant in her wedding gown, accompanied by her father. They began their slow walk down the aisle, and I could see the joy on her father's face, the pride in his posture, the way he held his daughter's arm like he was delivering something precious into safe hands. That should be me, I thought. In a few minutes, that should be me walking my son down this aisle, sharing this moment that fathers dream about from the day their children are born. But it wouldn't be me, it would be Richard. The bride and her father reached the altar, and after a few words from the officiant, it was time. Time for the moment that would make my replacement official, that would announce to everyone present that Richard had become Michael's father in every way that mattered. The music changed, and I saw Michael and Richard step forward, ready to begin their walk down the aisle. Michael's arm was linked through Richard's, just the way I'd always imagined my arm would be linked through his. Richard's face was beaming with pride and joy, clearly understanding the significance of this moment, the honor he'd been given. They began walking toward the altar, and I felt something break inside my chest. This was it. This was the moment I'd lost, the role I'd been denied, the dream that had been taken away from me and given to someone else. Michael looked calm and happy as they walked, completely at peace with his decision. There was no hesitation in his step, no glance back to find me in the crowd, no sign that he felt anything was missing from this perfect moment. And why would he? Richard was everything a father should be in this moment. Present, supportive, successful, proud. Richard could give Michael this beautiful wedding, this perfect ceremony, this entry into a social circle I could never provide access to. As they reached the altar, I realized that Michael wasn't missing anything. He had everything he needed for this moment. The only one missing anything was me. I gripped the back of the pew in front of me, trying to keep my composure, trying not to let the other guests see how much this was destroying me. Sarah's hand found mine and squeezed it, offering what comfort she could. But there was no comfort for this. There was no way to ease the pain of watching someone else live your moment, of seeing your child completely content without you, of realizing that your love and your history and your 32 years of fatherhood hadn't been enough to secure your place in the most important day of his life. The officiant began speaking about family, about the bonds that shape us, about honoring those who brought us to this moment. I wondered if Michael thought about me at all during those words, if he remembered that someone else had brought him to this moment long before Richard appeared in his life. But looking at his face, seeing his attention focused completely on his bride and the ceremony ahead, I realized he probably wasn't thinking about me at all. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was better that he could be completely present for his wedding, completely focused on his future, without any guilt or regret about the father he'd left sitting in the back row. When the officiant asked who gives this man to be married, Richard's voice rang out strong and clear. I do. Those words should have been mine. That moment of officially handing my son over to his new life should have belonged to me. But instead, I sat in the back of the church, a spectator to my own son's wedding, watching another man claim the honor I'd spent 32 years earning. The ceremony continued, but I barely heard the words. All I could think about was how completely I'd been erased from this moment, how thoroughly Richard had replaced me in every aspect that mattered. I'd raised Michael, loved him, sacrificed for him, been there for every important moment of his life until now, but none of that had been enough to secure my place at his side when it mattered most. I was still his biological father. I was still invited to the wedding, still welcome at family gatherings, still acknowledged as part of his history, but I was no longer his dad in any meaningful way. That role belonged to Richard now, and everyone in this church could see it. As Michael and his bride exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives, I made my own silent promise. I promised to find a way to accept this new reality, to be graceful about my diminished role, to love my son even though he'd chosen someone else to fill my place. It was the hardest promise I'd ever made. But sitting in that back pew, watching Richard stand where I should have been standing, I realized it was the only choice I had left. The ceremony was beautiful, perfect even, everything a wedding should be. Everything except the father of the groom, who sat alone in the back, invisible and irrelevant, mourning the loss of a relationship that had died so gradually he'd barely noticed until it was too late to save it. The moment I'd been dreading finally arrived as the processional music swelled through the church. I sat in my back row seat, watching Richard take my son's arm, and felt something die inside me. They stood together at the back of the sanctuary for a moment before beginning their walk. Richard looked distinguished in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. Michael looked handsome and confident, every inch the successful young man he'd become. Together, they made the picture of a proud father and son preparing for one of life's most important moments. the picture I should have been part of. As they began their slow walk down the aisle, the entire congregation rose to their feet. I stood with everyone else, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. Sarah's hand touched my elbow, a small gesture of support that I appreciated more than she could know. Michael's face was serene, happy, completely focused on his bride waiting at the altar. There was no conflict in his expression, no last-minute doubt about his choice to have Richard walk him down the aisle instead of me. He looked like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the right person beside him. That's what hurt the most. Not that Michael looked unhappy or conflicted, but that he looked perfectly content. He didn't seem to be missing anything, didn't appear to feel that anyone important was absent from this moment. Richard filled the father role so completely that Michael didn't seem to notice the real father sitting alone in the back. Richard's hand rested lightly on Michael's arm as they walked, the same gesture I'd imagined making countless times over the years. His face radiated pride and joy, the unmistakable expression of a father experiencing one of life's greatest honors. He understood the significance of this moment, the privilege he'd been given, the role he was playing in Michael's life. As they passed my row, Michael's eyes swept over the congregation, acknowledging the guests who had come to celebrate with him. His gaze passed right over me without pause, without recognition, without any sign that seeing his real father in the crowd meant anything special to him. I might as well have been invisible. They reached the front of the church, and Richard stepped back to take his place in the front row next to Linda. But first, he did something that felt like a knife in my chest. He embraced Michael, a quick but heartfelt hug between father and son before the ceremony began. Michael hugged him back with obvious affection, and I could see Richard whisper something in his ear that made Michael smile. Then Richard took his seat among the immediate family, in the place of honor reserved for the father of the groom, the place that should have been mine. The officiant, a distinguished older man who'd probably performed hundreds of weddings, began speaking about the sacred nature of marriage, about the joining of two families, about the importance of the community gathered to witness these vows. Marriage is not just the union of two individuals, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. It is the joining of families, the blending of histories, the creation of new bonds while honoring those that already exist. Honoring those that already exist. I wondered if anyone else in that church understood the irony of those words. Here we were, supposedly honoring existing bonds, while the most fundamental bond of all, the one between father and son, had been severed and reassigned to someone else. The officiant continued talking about the role of family in shaping us, about the people who guide us and support us and help us become who we're meant to be. Today, we celebrate not just Michael and Sarah's love for each other, but also the families who raised them, who instilled in them the values that brought them together, who prepared them for this moment. The families who raised them, I had raised Michael, had instilled values in him, had prepared him for this moment through 32 years of love and guidance and sacrifice. But Richard was getting credit for all of that now, sitting in the front row as the acknowledged father figure while I remained anonymous in the back. I looked around at the other guests, wondering if any of them knew the real story. Did they understand that the man in the front row, basking in the role of father of the groom, had only been in Michael's life for 5 years? Did they know that the actual father, the one who'd changed diapers and attended parent-teacher conferences and coached Little League and paid for college, was sitting alone in the back like a distant relative? Probably not. And even if they did know, would it matter to them? Richard looked the part of a successful father. He'd provided the wedding, the connections, the financial support that made this beautiful ceremony possible. In the eyes of most people, that probably qualified him for the honor more than my 32 years of daily fatherhood ever could. The bride's father had walked his daughter down the aisle with such obvious pride and joy. I'd watched his face during their processional, seen the tears in his eyes, the way he'd savored every step of that walk. He'd probably dreamed about that moment since the day his daughter was born, just like I'd dreamed about walking Michael down the aisle. But his dream had come true, while mine had been given away to someone else. The officiant asked the congregation to be seated, and we all settled back into our pews. From my position in the back, I had a clear view of the wedding party, of the families in the front rows, of Michael standing at the altar looking happier than I'd seen him in years. He looked successful, confident, surrounded by people who clearly cared about him and supported him. Richard's influence had given him access to opportunities and experiences I never could have provided. The wedding itself was proof of that. The beautiful venue, the elegant decorations, the distinguished guests all spoke to a level of success and social connection that my modest means could never have achieved. Maybe Michael was right to choose Richard. Maybe a father's love wasn't enough if it couldn't provide the practical benefits that someone like Richard could offer. Maybe in today's world, being a good father meant being a successful father, and success was measured in dollars and connections rather than love and sacrifice. The thought made me feel sick, but I couldn't shake it. Looking at this beautiful wedding, at Michael's obvious happiness, at the opportunities that Richard's wealth and influence had made possible, I had to wonder if my son was better off without me in this central role. But that didn't make it hurt less. The ceremony continued with readings about love and commitment, with music that filled the sanctuary with beauty and joy. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be for a young couple beginning their life together. The kind of wedding that any father would be proud to give his son. Except I wasn't giving it to him, Richard was. When the time came for the exchange of vows, I watched Michael speak words of love and commitment to his bride, promising to honor and cherish her for the rest of his life. His voice was strong and clear, full of emotion and sincerity. He'd grown into a good man, someone capable of love and commitment and responsibility. I'd played a role in making him that man. The values he was expressing, the character he was displaying, the ability to love deeply and commit fully. I'd helped instill those things in him through years of patient guidance and example. But Richard would get credit for the man Michael had become, just like he was getting credit for everything else. Richard was the one sitting in the position of honor, the one acknowledged as the father figure, the one who would be thanked and celebrated for raising such a fine young man. The bride spoke her vows with equal emotion and sincerity, promising to love Michael through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. She was a lovely young woman, clearly devoted to my son, obviously excited about their future together. Under different circumstances, I would have been thrilled to welcome her into our family, to gain a daughter through this marriage. But I wasn't gaining a daughter. I was just watching from a distance as my son created a new family that didn't really include me anymore. The officiant spoke about the rings they were about to exchange, about the symbolism of the unbroken circle, about the promises these symbols would represent in their daily lives. Michael and his bride placed the rings on each other's fingers with obvious joy, sealing their commitment to each other. I thought about my own wedding ring, long since removed and stored in a drawer after my divorce from Linda. I thought about the promises Linda and I had made to each other, about how confident we'd been that our love would last forever, about how impossible it had seemed that we could ever become strangers to each other. But we had become strangers, and somehow, in the process, I'd become a stranger to my son as well. By the power vested in me, the officiant said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The congregation erupted in applause as Michael kissed his new wife, officially beginning their marriage. They turned to face us, beaming with happiness, ready to begin their new life together. As they walked back down the aisle, accepting congratulations and good wishes from the guests, I caught Michael's eye for just a moment. He smiled and nodded in my direction, the kind of polite acknowledgement you might give to any wedding guest, not the look a son gives his father at the moment of his greatest triumph. Just a polite smile for someone who happened to be in the crowd. Richard and Linda followed the wedding party down the aisle, arm in arm, clearly established as the parents of the groom. Other guests reached out to shake Richard's hand, to congratulate him on his son's wedding, to acknowledge his role in this joyous occasion. The son he'd known for 5 years, the wedding he'd paid for, the role he'd claimed through wealth and strategic patience. As the sanctuary began to empty, with guests heading to the reception area for cocktails and celebration, I remained in my seat for a few extra moments. Sarah stayed with me, understanding that I needed time to process what had just happened. You okay? She asked. Quietly. I nodded, though we both knew it wasn't true. I'd just watched my son get married without me playing any meaningful role in the ceremony. I'd seen another man receive the honor I'd spent 32 years earning. I'd been present for the most important day of Michael's life, but completely irrelevant to it. "Come on," Sarah said gently. "Let's go to the reception. Maybe things will be better there." But as we walked out of the sanctuary, following the crowd toward the celebration I hadn't been included in planning, I knew things wouldn't be better. The ceremony was over, the official transfer of roles was complete, and I was now just another wedding guest at my own son's reception. The man who'd raised him was relegated to table 12, while the man who'd paid for the party sat at the head table, accepting congratulations for a job well done. The ceremony was nearing its conclusion when something happened that no one, least of all me, could have predicted. Michael and his bride were standing at the altar, having just exchanged rings, glowing with happiness as the officiant prepared to pronounce them husband and wife. The congregation was settling into that final moment of anticipation, everyone ready to celebrate the completion of the vows. That's when David stood up. David was the bride's brother, a young man in his early 30s who I'd barely noticed during the ceremony. He'd been sitting in the front row with the bride's immediate family, just another face in the wedding party as far as I was concerned. I'd seen him at the rehearsal dinner the night before, a brief event I'd been invited to but felt out of place at, but we hadn't spoken more than a few polite words. Now he was on his feet, and something in his posture made the entire congregation turn to look at him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to say something." A murmur of confusion rippled through the church. This wasn't part of the planned ceremony. The officiant looked uncertain, Michael looked puzzled, and Richard's face immediately showed annoyance at this breach of wedding protocol. "I know this isn't normal," David continued, "but sometimes normal isn't right." He stepped into the aisle, and I could see his face more clearly now. He looked determined, almost resolute, like someone who'd made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through. "My sister Sarah is about to marry a wonderful man," he said, looking at Michael with obvious affection. "And Michael, you're gaining a family today who's excited to love you and support you. But I'm looking around this church, and I see something that's not right." The sanctuary was completely silent now. Even the wedding party seemed frozen, unsure of what was happening or how to respond. David's eyes found me in the back row, and suddenly I realized with a shock that whatever he was about to say, it was going to be about me. "Michael," David said, turning back toward the altar, "your real father is sitting alone in the back of this church, and that's not right." My heart stopped. Every eye in the sanctuary turned toward me, and I felt heat flood my face. Sarah's hand gripped mine so tightly it almost hurt. "I don't know the whole story," David continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I don't know what happened between you and your dad, or why another man walked you down the aisle today, but I know what I see." Richard had gone rigid in his front row seat, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Linda looked mortified, her hand on Richard's arm as if to restrain him from interrupting. Michael stood at the altar looking pale and uncertain, glancing between David and me with an expression I couldn't read. "I see a man who raised you," David said, his voice growing stronger. "I see a man who loves you. I see a man who deserves to be standing up here with us on the most important day of your life." The silence in the church was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the stares of 200 guests, could sense the tension radiating from Richard and Linda in the front row. David stepped farther into the aisle, his attention still focused on Michael. "My father died when I was 16, he said, and his voice cracked slightly with emotion. "Car accident. I would give anything, anything to have him here today, to have him see me get married, to have him walk my sister down the aisle when her time comes." Tears were visible on his face now, but he kept talking. "I would give anything to have my father back for even one day, and I can't sit here and watch you throw away what I'll never have again." Michael's face had gone completely white. His bride was looking between her brother and her new husband with obvious distress, clearly torn between supporting David and not wanting to ruin her wedding day. "David," the officiant said gently, "perhaps we should—" "No," David said firmly. "This needs to be said. Michael, I don't know your father well, but I've watched him today. I've seen how he looks at you. I've seen the pain in his eyes, and I know that kind of pain because I feel it every day, missing my own dad." He turned and looked directly at me, his eyes full of compassion and determination. "Sir, would you please come up here?" The church erupted in whispers and murmurs. Richard started to stand. clearly intending to object, but Linda pulled him back down with a sharp look. Michael stood frozen at the altar, his mouth slightly open, staring at me with an expression of shock and something that might have been recognition. For a moment, I couldn't move. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to sit quietly in the back, accept my diminished role, let Richard have his moment of triumph without causing any disruption. But David was extending his hand toward me, and his eyes were pleading with me to respond. "Please," he said, "come stand with us." Sarah gave me a gentle push. "Go," she whispered. "Go." My legs felt unsteady as I stood up, and the entire congregation turned to watch me make my way down the aisle. It was the longest walk of my life, past all those expensive cars owners, past Richard's family and friends, past Linda and Richard himself, whose face was now purple with rage. When I reached the front of the church, David stepped forward and shook my hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm sorry it took a stranger to make this right." Then he turned toward Michael, who was still standing at the altar looking stunned. "Michael," David said, "I know this is your wedding day, and I know this isn't how you planned it. But some things are more important than plans. Some things are more important than money or social position or who has the biggest house." He gestured toward me. "This man raised you. This man loves you. This man has been part of every important moment of your life until today, and if you let him continue standing alone in the back of this church, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Michael's eyes were filled with tears now. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months, not as an inconvenience or an obligation, but as his father. "Dad?" he said, and his voice broke on the word. It was the first time he'd called me that with any real emotion in years. Richard finally couldn't contain himself anymore. He stood up and started to say something, but Linda grabbed his arm and shook her head firmly. "Richard, no," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for the front rows to hear. "Not now, not here." The officiant, clearly a man with experience in handling unexpected situations, stepped forward with remarkable calm. "Perhaps," he said diplomatically, "we could have both fathers stand with Michael for the remainder of the ceremony." But David shook his head. "With respect, sir, there's only one father here. There's the man who raised Michael, and there's the man who married his mother. Those are two very different things." Michael took a shaky step toward me, and suddenly I could see the boy he used to be, uncertain, vulnerable, needing his father's guidance. "Dad, I'm sorry," he whispered, and then louder, for the whole church to hear. "I'm so sorry." Before I could respond, he crossed the remaining distance between us and wrapped me in a hug. A real hug. Desperate and full of emotion, the kind of hug we used to share when he was younger and the world seemed simpler. "I love you," I whispered against his shoulder, because it was the only thing that mattered, the only thing I'd wanted to tell him for months. "I know," he said. "I love you too. I've been so stupid." The congregation was completely silent now, witnessing something that hadn't been planned or rehearsed or paid for, just raw emotion and the restoration of something that should never have been broken. When Michael finally pulled back from our embrace, his eyes were red but clearer than they'd been in years. "Will you stand with me?" he asked. "Will you finish this ceremony with me?" I looked past him at his bride, who was crying but smiling, clearly moved by what she was witnessing. I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. I even glanced at Richard, whose face was a storm of fury and embarrassment, and Linda, who looked torn between supporting her husband and doing what was right for her son. "Yes," I said, "of course I will." The officiant, demonstrating remarkable grace under pressure, gestured for us to take our positions. "Shall we continue?" he asked. Michael nodded, wiping his eyes, and positioned himself next to his bride with me standing beside him. David returned to his seat with the bride's family, his mission accomplished. As the ceremony resumed, I caught David's eye and mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded once, and I saw in his face the grief he carried for his own father, the loss that had motivated him to prevent Michael from making a mistake he'd regret forever. The officiant continued with the final portions of the ceremony, and when he asked who gives this man to be married, I felt Michael's hand squeeze mine. "I do," I said, my voice strong and clear, the words I'd dreamed of saying for 32 years, the moment that should have been mine from the beginning. As the ceremony concluded and Michael kissed his bride as a married man, I realized that David had given me something precious, not just the chance to stand with my son during his wedding, but the opportunity to reclaim my place in his life. It hadn't happened the way I'd imagined it would. It had taken the intervention of a young man who understood the value of fatherhood because he'd lost his own father too young. But sometimes the most important moments come to us in ways we never expect, through the kindness of strangers who see truth more clearly than family. Standing there beside my son, officially recognized as his father once again, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope that our relationship could be healed, that love and history could triumph over money and convenience, that being someone's real father still meant something in this world. The ceremony was over, but in many ways, our real journey back to each other was just beginning. The silence in the church after David's words was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, witnessing something that felt more real and raw than any planned ceremony could ever be. Michael stood at the altar, tears streaming down his face, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a vulnerable, uncertain, needing his father. For the first time in years, the successful young man facade had dropped away, and I could see the boy I'd raised, the son who used to come to me when the world felt too complicated to navigate alone. "Dad," he said again, and this time the word carried weight, carried meaning, carried all the love and regret and recognition that had been missing from our relationship for so long. I started walking toward him then, my legs unsteady, but my purpose clear. Each step down that aisle felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me, something I'd almost given up hope of ever getting back. Richard was on his feet now, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He started to say something, probably to object to this disruption of his carefully orchestrated event, but Linda grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. "Richard, don't!" she hissed, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Don't make this worse." When I reached the altar, Michael met me halfway, and suddenly we were embracing like we hadn't in years. Not the polite, perfunctory hugs we'd exchanged at family gatherings, but a real embrace between father and son, full of emotion and recognition and forgiveness. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." "It's okay," I whispered back, though my voice was shaking. "It's okay, son. I love you. I know you do. I've always known that. I got confused. I let other people make me think that what you gave me wasn't enough, wasn't important." I pulled back to look at his face, and I could see the Michael I remembered, the boy who'd trusted me completely, who'd believed I could fix anything, who'd been proud to be my son. "You're here now," I said. "That's all that matters." The officiant, clearly a man with experience in handling delicate situations, stepped forward with remarkable composure. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "we should continue with the ceremony. I thought, NK, everyone would like to see these two young people officially married." Michael nodded, wiping his eyes, but he didn't move away from me. Instead, he looked at his bride, who was crying but smiling, clearly moved by what she was witnessing. "Sarah," he said to her, "I want my father to stand with me, my real father." She nodded immediately. "Of course, that's how it should be." The wedding party repositioned themselves, and I found myself standing where I should have been from the beginning, beside my son, supporting him as he took this crucial step into his future. Richard remained in his seat, his jaw clenched, his entire body radiating fury at having his moment usurped. But this wasn't Richard's moment anymore. It was mine and Michael's. The officiant resumed the ceremony with remarkable grace, and when he reached the moment where he asked who gives this man to be married, Michael's hand found mine and squeezed it tight. "I do," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. The words I'd dreamed of saying since the day Michael was born, the moment that should have been mine all along. As I spoke those words, I felt Michael squeeze my hand tighter, and I knew he understood what this meant to me, what he'd almost taken away, what David's courage had restored. The ceremony concluded quickly after that, with Michael and Sarah exchanging their final vows and sealing their marriage with a kiss. But now I was part of it, standing beside my son as he began this new chapter of his life, officially recognized as his father once again. As the new couple turned to face the congregation, Michael's arm went around my shoulder in a gesture that felt natural and right. We walked down the aisle together, father and son, the way it should have been from the beginning. Behind us, I could hear Richard's family talking in urgent, hushed whispers, clearly upset by the disruption to their carefully planned event. But I couldn't bring myself to care about their discomfort. For the first time in months, I felt like I belonged. Somewhere, like my presence mattered, like I was more than just an inconvenient reminder of Michael's past. In the receiving line that formed outside the church, I stood next to Michael and Sarah, accepting congratulations from guests who seemed genuinely moved by what they'd witnessed. Many of them commented on David's intervention, calling it brave and necessary, saying it was one of the most powerful moments they'd ever seen at a wedding. An older woman I didn't recognize shook my hand warmly and said, "That young man did exactly the right thing. Family is family, and money can't change that." A man about my age clasped my shoulder and said, "I've got 3 sons, and what I saw in there gave me chills. You should be proud of that boy for recognizing what matters." But it wasn't Michael who had recognized what mattered. It was David. Michael had been prepared to go through with the entire ceremony without me, had been comfortable excluding me from the most important day of his life. It had taken a stranger's intervention to make him see what he was throwing away. Still, he was seeing it now. That was what mattered. Richard and Linda stood at the other end of the receiving line, looking stiff and uncomfortable, clearly struggling to maintain their composure in front of the guests. Richard's face was still flushed with anger, and I could see him whispering urgently to Linda between conversations with well-wishers. When the receiving line finally ended, Michael pulled me aside. "Dad, can we talk for a minute? Just you and me?" We stepped away from the crowd, finding a quiet spot near the side of the church. Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to work through something difficult. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "I feel like such an idiot." "You're not an idiot, Michael. You just got caught up on something complicated." "No, I was an idiot, and I was ungrateful, and I almost made the biggest mistake of my life." He looked at me with eyes that were red from crying but clearer than they'd been in years. "Do you know what David told me after the ceremony? He said he thinks about his father every single day, wishes he could call him for advice or share good news with him or just hear his voice one more time. And here I was, throwing away what he'd give anything to have back." "David's a remarkable young man," I said. "I need to thank him properly. He saved us, Dad. He saved our relationship, because I was too blind to see what I was doing to you, too caught up in other people's opinions and expectations." Michael's voice broke slightly, and I could see him struggling with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. Richard kept telling me that I needed to think practically, that I needed to consider who'd been more present in my life recently, who'd done more for me financially. He made it sound like choosing him to walk me down the aisle was just the logical thing to do. "He was protecting his investment," I said quietly. "He'd spent 5 years positioning himself to replace me, and today was his payoff." "God, Dad, when you put it like that, it sounds so calculating." "Because it was calculating. Richard's not a bad man, but he saw an opportunity to become the most important father figure in your life, and he took it. Very strategically, very patiently." Michael shook his head, looking disgusted with himself. How did I not see it? "Because it happened gradually, and because what he was offering you was genuinely valuable. Better job prospects, financial security, social connections. Those aren't small things, Michael. I couldn't compete with what he could provide. But that's not what being a father is about. No, but it's easy to forget that when you're young and building a career and trying to establish yourself." Richard's advantages were very real, very practical. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then he looked at me with an expression of profound regret. "I almost lost you, didn't I? I almost threw away the most important relationship in my life for money and social status." "You didn't throw it away," I said. "It's still here. We're still here. But what if David hadn't spoken up? What if he hadn't made me see what I was doing? I would have gone through with it, Dad. I would have let Richard walk me down the aisle and never thought twice about it." The honesty of that admission hurt, but I appreciated it. Michael was facing the truth of what had almost happened, what he'd been prepared to do. "But David did speak up," I said, "and you did respond. That's what matters now. I want to make this right, Michael said urgently. I want to fix what I broke. It's not broken beyond repair, I assured him. Damaged, maybe, but not broken. What can I do? How can I show you that you matter to me, that you're still my dad in every way that counts? I thought about that question, about what I really needed from him going forward. Just don't let anyone convince you that our relationship is less important than it is. Don't let money or social position or anyone's expectations make you forget that I'm your father, and that means something that can't be bought or replaced. Never again, he said firmly. I swear to you, Dad, never again. We stood there for another moment, and I felt something settle between us. Not complete healing, because that would take time, but the beginning of restoration. The recognition that what we had was worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth prioritizing over other considerations. We should probably get to the reception, Michael said finally. People are waiting. Lead the way, I said. As we walked toward the reception venue, Michael's arm around my shoulder, I caught sight of David near the entrance. He was talking to his sister Sarah, but when he saw me approaching, he stepped away from her and came over to us. Mr. Peterson, he said, extending his hand to me. Please call me James, and thank you. I don't think I can express how grateful I am for what you did. I had to do it, he said simply. I couldn't watch someone throw away what I'd give anything to have back. Your father would be proud of you, I told him. What you did took tremendous courage. He always told me to do the right thing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Michael stepped forward and embraced David, a gesture of gratitude and respect between two young men who understood the value of fatherhood from different perspectives. Thank you for saving me from the biggest mistake of my life, Michael said. Just don't waste the second chance, David replied. Not everyone gets one. As we entered the reception together, I realized that this day had become something none of us had expected. Not the perfect, choreographed event that Richard had planned and paid for, but something more valuable. A reminder that love and family and authentic relationships matter more than money or status or social expectations. The reception would be awkward, I knew. Richard would be furious, Linda would be embarrassed, and there would be tension and uncomfortable conversations. But Michael and I would face all of that together, as father and son, the way we should have been facing everything all along. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful about our future. The reception hall buzzed with an energy I hadn't expected. What should have been awkward tension after David's dramatic intervention had transformed into something else entirely. A celebration that felt more authentic than any perfectly planned event could have been. I stood near the entrance with Michael and Sarah, still part of the receiving line, watching guests approach with genuine warmth and excitement. Person after person congratulated Michael, not just on his marriage, but on his decision to include me in the ceremony. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen at a wedding, an elderly woman told Michael, tears in her eyes. Your young man there, she gestured toward David, reminded us all what really matters. Michael's face glowed with something I hadn't seen in years. Pride in our relationship, pride in being my son. Each compliment about David's intervention, each comment about the importance of family, seemed to reinforce his understanding of what had almost been lost. Richard and Linda held their position at the other end of the receiving line, maintaining their composure but clearly struggling. Richard's jaw remained clenched, his responses to guests polite but strained. Linda looked embarrassed and conflicted, caught between supporting her husband and acknowledging that what had happened was right. When the receiving line finally ended, we moved into the main reception area, a beautifully decorated space that spoke to Richard's taste and budget. Round tables covered in crisp linens, elaborate floral centerpieces, a dance floor polished to perfection. Everything money could buy to create the perfect wedding reception. But the energy in the room was about something money couldn't purchase. Michael stayed close to me as we navigated the cocktail hour, introducing me to his friends and colleagues as my dad, with a warmth in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Not James or my father, with the distant politeness I'd grown accustomed to, but my dad, intimate, proud, connected. This is my dad, he'd say, his hand on my shoulder. He's the one who taught me everything that really matters. Each introduction felt like a small miracle, a restoration of something I'd thought was lost forever. David appeared at my elbow during one of these conversations, holding 2 glasses of champagne. Thought you might need this, he said, offering me one of the glasses. Thank you, for everything. We stood together for a moment, watching Michael across the room, animated in conversation with some of his college friends. He looks different than he did an hour ago, David observed. How so? Lighter, like he's not carrying around guilt anymore, like he remembered who he is. David was right. There was something in Michael's posture, in his expressions, that reminded me of the young man he'd been before Richard's influence had gradually changed him. More relaxed, more genuine, more like the son I'd raised. "Can I ask you something?" I said to David. "Of course." "What made you do it? What made you stand up like that?" David was quiet for a moment, swirling the champagne in his glass. "My dad died on a Tuesday," he said finally. "Car accident on his way home from work. The last thing I'd said to him that morning was that I was too busy to help him with some project he wanted to work on that weekend." He paused, and I could see the pain that still lived in his eyes. I'd give anything to take back those words, to have helped him with that project, to have spent that time with him. And I see people all around me taking their parents for granted, treating them like they're disposable, like there will always be more time to make things right. He looked directly at me then. "Your son was about to make a choice he'd regret for the rest of his life, and I couldn't sit there and watch it happen, not when I know what it's like to lose your father and realize too late what you had." "Your father raised a remarkable son," I said. "He did his best with the time he had, just like you did with Michael. That's what matters." Dinner was announced, and I found myself at table 6, not table 12 as originally planned, but one much closer to the head table. Sarah, my sister, was there along with several of Michael's childhood friends and their spouses. People who remembered me as Michael's dad, who'd been confused by my relegation to the back of the church but were clearly pleased by the turn of events. "James, we were so glad to see you up there with Michael," said Tom, one of Michael's Little League teammates whose father had coached alongside me for several seasons. "It didn't feel right seeing you in the back row." "None of us understood what was happening," added Tom's wife. "We kept looking around for you during the processional, wondering why Richard was walking Michael instead of you." Their comments warmed me, but they also highlighted how obvious my exclusion had been to people who knew our history. It hadn't been subtle or diplomatic. It had been a clear statement that I was no longer Michael's father in any meaningful way, but that was changing now. During dinner, Michael approached our table with Sarah on his arm. They'd been making rounds, visiting with guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. "Dad," Michael said, "can we sit with you for a few minutes?" They pulled up chairs from a nearby table, and suddenly I was sharing dinner conversation with the bride and groom, something that should have happened naturally, but had required David's intervention to make possible. "I owe all of you an apology," Michael said, addressing the table but looking primarily at me. "I got caught up in things that didn't matter and almost forgot what does matter." "What matters is that you figured it out," said Tom. "That's what makes a man, recognizing when you've made a mistake and having the courage to fix it." Sarah, my new daughter-in-law, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she said. "I could see how much you were hurting, and I should have said something to Michael." "This isn't your fault," I assured her. "You were trying to keep peace on your wedding day." Still, David was braver than I was. He saw what was right and acted on it, even though it wasn't his place. "Sometimes it takes an outsider to see clearly," Michael said. David didn't have any agenda, any complicated history. He just saw a father being pushed aside and a son making a mistake. As we talked, I noticed Richard across the room, sitting stiffly at the head table, barely touching his food. Linda was trying to engage him in conversation with other guests, but his responses were minimal, his attention clearly elsewhere. "Is Richard very angry?" I asked Michael quietly. Michael glanced toward the head table and nodded. "Furious. He feels humiliated, like David made him look foolish in front of everyone." "Maybe I should talk to him." "Dad, no, you don't owe him anything. If anything, he owes you an apology for trying to replace you." But I could see the tension Richard's anger was creating, the way it was affecting Linda and casting a shadow over what should have been a joyful celebration. "I don't want your wedding day to be about conflict," I said. "Maybe if I acknowledged his contributions, thanked him for what he's done for you." Michael shook his head firmly. "This isn't your responsibility to fix. Richard made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences." Sarah agreed. "David told me Richard tried to corner him after the ceremony, demanding to know who he thought he was to interfere. David told him he was someone who understood the value of having a father." "How did Richard respond to that?" "Not well. But David didn't back down. He said some things that needed to be said. As the evening progressed, the fear in the room seemed to split into two distinct energies. Around our table and several others, there was joy and celebration. People genuinely happy about Michael's marriage and the restoration of our relationship, but around the head table, there was tension and uncomfortable silence. Richard barely participated in the traditional wedding activities. He didn't give a speech, though he'd been scheduled to. He didn't join in the toasts or the dancing. He sat at his table like a storm cloud, radiating displeasure and making everyone around him uncomfortable. When the time came for the father-son dance, Michael didn't hesitate. He walked directly to our table and extended his hand to me. "Dad, would you dance with me?" I'd dreamed of this moment for 32 years, imagining the song we'd choose, the words we might exchange, the emotion of sharing that traditional father-son moment. We walked to the dance floor as the band began playing "The Way You Look Tonight." Not a typical father-son song, but one that held meaning for us. I'd sung it to Michael when he was little, during those late-night moments when he couldn't sleep, and I'd rock him in the chair by his bedroom window. As we began to dance, I could see other guests watching us with obvious emotion. Several people were crying, moved by the significance of the moment, by the knowledge of what had almost been lost. "Do you remember this song?" I asked Michael as we swayed slowly to the music. "Of course I remember. You used to sing it to me when I couldn't sleep. You were such a restless baby. Your mother would be exhausted, and I'd take the night shift, walking the floors with you. And you'd sing this song until I finally settled down, sometimes for hours. But I didn't mind. Those were some of my favorite moments, just you and me in the quiet house. Everything else in the world shut out." Michael's eyes filled with tears again. "How did I forget that? How did I forget all those nights, all those moments when it was just us?" "You didn't forget. You just got distracted by other things for a while. But the memories are still there, and so are we." As the song continued, I saw Linda watching us from the head table, tears streaming down her face. Whatever complicated feelings she had about the day's events, she could see the love between Michael and me, could recognize the authenticity of our relationship. Richard, however, had turned away, unable or unwilling to witness the moment he'd tried so hard to claim for himself. When the song ended, Michael hugged me tightly on the dance floor, and the room erupted in applause. Not polite wedding applause, but genuine appreciation for what they'd witnessed. "Thank you, Dad," Michael whispered, "for everything, for raising me, for loving me, for being patient while I figured things out." "Thank you for finding your way back to me," I whispered in return. As the evening wound down, guests began to leave, but many stopped to speak with me before departing. They shared their own stories about fathers and sons, about the importance of family, about how moved they'd been by David's courage and Michael's response. An older gentleman I didn't recognize approached me near the end of the evening. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Thank me? For what?" "For showing us all what real fatherhood looks like. My son and I have been having some difficulties lately, and watching what happened today, it reminded me that love is more important than pride." "I hope you can work things out," I said. "We will. What I saw here tonight convinced me that it's worth fighting for." As the reception hall began to empty, Michael found me again. "Dad, Sarah and I are leaving for our honeymoon tomorrow, but when we get back I want us to have dinner, just the two of us. We have a lot of catching up to do. I'd like that very much, and I want to hear more stories about when I was litted. I feel like I've forgotten too much of our history together." "We'll remember it together," I promised. As Michael and Sarah left for their honeymoon suite, and as the last guests departed, I found myself alone with my thoughts for the first time since David's dramatic intervention. The reception hall looked different now, chairs pushed back from tables, flowers beginning to wilt, the remnants of a celebration that had become something none of us had expected. Not the perfect, controlled event Richard had orchestrated, but something more valuable, a reminder of what really matters. David approached me as I prepared to leave. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Grateful," I said honestly. "Hopeful, like I got my son back." "You never lost him, not really. He just got confused for a while about what was important. Without you, I think that confusion might have become permanent." David shook his head. "Michael's a good man. He would have figured it out eventually. I just helped speed up the process." As I drove home that night, I reflected on how dramatically the day had changed from what I'd expected. I'd prepared myself to watch from the sidelines as Richard claimed the father role at Michael's wedding. Instead, I'd been restored to my rightful place through the courage of a young man who understood the irreplaceable value of fatherhood. The road back to a full relationship with Michael wouldn't be quick or simple. There was hurt to heal, trust to rebuild, new patterns to establish. Richard would remain part of Michael's life, and we'd all need to find a way to coexist peacefully. But the most important thing had been accomplished. Michael remembered who his father was and why that mattered. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I realized I was no longer the forgotten father sitting alone in the back of the church. I was Michael's dad again, recognized and valued and loved. Sometimes the most important battles are won not through force or confrontation, but through the unexpected kindness of strangers who see truth more clearly than those caught up in complicated situations. David had given me back my son, and in doing so, had reminded all of us that some relationships are too precious to sacrifice for convenience, money, or social expectations. The wedding was over, but our real journey, the journey back to each other, was just beginning. And for the first time in months, I was confident we'd find our way,